Hey guys, welcome back to Behind the Feast. Now today's video is going to be a little bit different. Today we're going to be talking about 5 tips to help you with shooting interviews, specifically shooting and lighting them. So this is not an instructional video. This is more of a video of tips that I have. There are plenty of instructional videos out there on how to shoot a 2-camera interview. And I've already done a 3-point lighting video, so you can always check that out. I'll put the link for that one down below. So now on to our first tip. So my first tip, and I can't emphasize this enough, do not, I repeat, do not rely on natural light. Generally, whenever I'm prepping any room for an interview, the first thing I do is I'm asking, can we close the blinds? Can I block off these windows? Do I need to get a bunch of floppies up, block out the windows, because the sun can mess with you in really unexpected ways. Classic example is I was shooting an interview, I think a few months back. There was a big window there, but the situation was I think we couldn't park our trailer nearby, so we had to run with a very small setup. I just kind of had to work with what I had. We had this really nice shot set up against the wall, and we started shooting, and everything looked great when we started, but slowly and gradually, as we were shooting, the sun moved and began to shine through the window, and a shadow began to slowly appear onto the wall and get more and more pronounced. It wasn't until basically we were about to cut that we noticed it. Now, we only had limited time to the subject, so we couldn't do the interview again. So we had to fix that in post, and luckily we were able to. Now, one way you can really help to account for those situations when they do occur when you have all your equipment is we were shooting this one award video in the lobby of this big new facility they had just built. It was gorgeous, but the whole thing was based on the fact that everywhere in the building gets light. The windows were just so massive, there was nothing we could do about it. So what I specifically opted to do was I set up a 4x4 floppy. I positioned that over the subject, and that way that blocked all the light coming in from the window, and then I keyed from the opposite side. So that way, when the sunlight did fluctuate in that interview, the subject remained the same. So in those situations, as much as you can, if you can block off the windows, do it. Whenever you work with the sun is always going to be doing its own thing, and it does not care about the fact that you're shooting. Now, of course, one thing I recommend is this app on smartphones called Sunseeker. Definitely download it. It'll tell you the exact path of the sun, so you can track exactly when the sun's going to be a problem. Tip number 2, when positioning your 2-camera interview setup, I think it's always best to position the subject's face in the same part of frame in both shots. That way, when you're cutting back and forth, the audience doesn't have to move their eye to look at the face as it moves back and forth. That'll make your cuts a lot less noticeable. Tip number 3, set your 180 and stick to it. If you're not familiar with the 180 rule, it's very important. Basically what that means is that, for example, look at this setup right here. I'm sitting kind of facing this way a little bit, but looking at the camera. If there was a second camera, I would put it right there, because you want to draw a line from where your subject is looking and put your cameras on this side of it, and then you light on this side of it. That's good for 2 reasons. A, it's much easier to light when you're filming from one side and lighting from another. The other cool thing is, for example, this shot looks really good, but if we jump to the other side of the 180 right here, this shot looks completely different. You don't see the setback there anymore. You see this whole wall that you didn't see before. They have very different backgrounds. They're on different sides of my face. They're a little jarring. And sometimes if you are cutting back and forth like that and the backgrounds look different enough, they might think you're cutting back and forth between 2 different interviews. Tip number 4, use your waveform or false color to distinguish your subject's face from the background using either color or exposure. So I think this is very important because when your audience is viewing your video, you want your subject's face to be the natural focal point of the image. Some ways to do this are look at your waveform and make sure that your background is brighter than your subject or darker than your subject. It is not at the same plane, because otherwise it's just kind of a flat image. One way you can do that is maybe turn off some of the lights in there if you have multiple switches or different lights that can be blocked off. Like if you have some duvetine, some trash bag material, you can put that on the ceiling, block off some of the lights in the background, and just kind of bring the exposure of the background down too. Or if your lights are bright enough, you could always just kind of stop down the image, lower the exposure, and then just light them brighter. That could be a little intense for the subject, but if you can pull it off, it'll make your entire interview look a lot better. In terms of color though, there have been times where I've had to film against very tan wooden walls, and when I had a subject in front of it with a similar skin tone, while the exposure was somewhat different, it still felt like the exact same color. Now, this can be tricky in post because sometimes I like to do skin tone corrections in post. Maybe sometimes people's face get a little red. I can go in there and clean that up a little bit. But when the subject's face is the same color as the wall, I do the little ink dropper tool in their face, everything in the image is captured and I cannot isolate them in any way. I have to use power windows. It takes a lot more time. So one thing I found I like to do in those situations is I'll put a light on the background and I'll set the color temperature different, maybe a little cooler, just to change that color just a little bit so that the subject appears different from the background. Overall, it'll just make the image a lot more satisfying to look at. And of course, the audience's eye will be drawn to your subject, and that's exactly what you want. Tip number 5, match the white balance of the house lights if you have to use them. So when I say house lights, I mean the lights at the actual place where you're filming. If you're filming in somebody's office, you're filming at a school, or you're filming in somebody's house, and you can't just use your own lights, make sure you are matching the white balance, because I've seen so many videos, whether it's YouTube or other videos, where you'll have this disgusting yellow tungsten light in the background that just looks orange or yellow, and it doesn't look good. That's why when you're setting up your shot, you want to make sure you really look at the viewfinder, or you look at your monitor and you make sure that you have that white balance balanced out. Now, if you can do custom white balances with a Kelvin temperature, I know Sony's can do that. I think other cameras can too. Most internal temperatures, if it's full tungsten, is about 2800 Kelvin. About 3200 Kelvin is what I've also seen. 4500 Kelvin is sometimes that in the middle, in that middle light you'll see. Some places have daylight balanced lights at 5500 Kelvin. So cycling between those common ones can be a good way to guess it. Cycling that around until everything looks white can really help. Especially if you have a white card, you can have somebody hold up the white card and you just adjust until that appears white. Now, if you're in a situation where you have to work with natural light, maybe you got big windows like I had in that one lobby scenario, 5500 Kelvin is your white balance. Just trust me on that. That is the color temperature of the sun. Of course, if you're doing this a lot and you want to make it a lot easier, I definitely recommend picking up a Sekonic spectrometer. They are very expensive. They're about $1,800. But this will tell you exactly what the white balance is. I just hold it up, I meter, it'll tell me exactly what my white balance is. If I metered this light right now, it'd tell me it was 5500 Kelvin because I'm lighting daylight right now. I highly recommend that for professional results. Of course, I think there's a cheaper version of it. I think there's an Illuminati color meter. I haven't played around with it myself, but I've heard people got good results from it. We'll link that one down below. I think it's like $1,000 cheaper. So I highly recommend that. But honestly, I love my spectrometer. I use it on every shoot. I check the white balance of everything because I want to make sure everything's appearing white, because unless you're shooting raw, you cannot really fix that in post. Now, of course, if you're shooting log, you might have some flexibility there, but it will not match getting it right on set. There's no excuse for shooting wrong. Now, of course, the argument can be made for auto white balance. Some of the cameras are getting a little bit better. I still wouldn't put my faith in it. The auto white balance can misread things, get the wrong white balance, and change throughout an interview depending on just the light conditions it thinks it sees. So those are my 5 tips. Now, I do have one bonus tip for you. Shoot a lot of B-roll. Like as much B-roll as you can. If you have a crew that can take down the set for you and you have the subject still there for maybe 5-10 more minutes, take the camera off sticks, throw it on 60 frames a second if you don't have a gimbal, and just film your subject walking around. Think of anything they talked about in the interview that you can get them to recreate. Maybe get them sitting at their desk working on something, pretending to be on a phone call. Like just get that footage that you can play over top of the B-roll, because if you mess up any of the tips that I mentioned before, you can cover up almost your entire interview and have it almost function as voiceover if you have the corresponding footage that could play over top of it. Honestly, B-roll can save your butt in the long run. It can really take the weight off of your subject to say everything perfectly when you have a lot of B-roll to cover things up. So those are all the tips I have for you. If you guys enjoyed this video and you learned something, hit the like button. If you have any tips of your own or questions, leave it in the comments down below. I'll be down answering them. If you like our videos and you want to keep seeing them, definitely subscribe and hit the bell icon. It really helps us out. And I'll see you on the next one.